Shall we start now? Okay, that is 15. All right. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the last and final session for the Medico-Legal webinar series. The last session we have is on the Infectious Disease Act and COVID-19. Today we have the lovely Sara Lau from SKRINE, and she'll be talking about this hot topic. Go on,
Hi,
Sarah.
everyone. Hi, everyone. So I have a bunch of slides. Umi, can we? Yeah, okay. So that I could share my screen. Hold on a moment. Just hold on a moment while I share the screen. Okay, hello, good afternoon, everyone. I apologize for the delay. There was a bit of a technical error. Okay, so to begin with, let me give you a brief introduction of myself. My name is Sarah. I am a senior associate in SKRINE, that's a law firm in Kuala Lumpur. I've been in practice for about 7 years now, going on my 8th year. The area of my focus, my legal focus, is actually in employment, immigration, and medical legal matters. So today I've been invited to speak to you about COVID-19 and the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases Act 1988. Okay, so without further ado, I think we can go ahead and begin now. I think if most of you are doctors, you would understand that COVID-19 is a respiratory disease which first made its mark in Wuhan in December 2019. Now, it emerged first as a very mysterious disease, and there was pushback from the Chinese government on recognizing whether it was a new disease, and it later emerged that it was a new coronavirus. Its common symptoms are innocent enough: fever, cough, fatigue, breathing difficulties. These are symptoms that, in my mind, would not present such a serious complication. But not even 1 year later, it's not December 2020 yet, and we see that there have already been 1.34 million deaths with over 55.6 million infections all around the globe. And we know that it has caused so much havoc all over the world. A lot of people ask, is it the deadliest flu pandemic in the history of mankind? Not really. I think we have seen many flu pandemics in the past, like the Spanish flu, the London flu. There was SARS, there was MERS, And throughout history, there are many flu pandemics that's littered throughout history, and of course, there's also the ongoing pandemic, which is the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But what is interesting about COVID-19 is I think that we have never actually seen in modern times a response such as the response that the world now gives to COVID-19, despite it not being the deadliest flu pandemic. And what's even more interesting is that, at the height of medical advancement, medical technology advancement, we can still see that it has a never before seen impact on on economies and livelihood and really life worldwide. So as COVID-19 continues to ravage, our daily lives, we see that drastic measures have been taken down. There have been economic shutdown, for example. In Melbourne, they have gone through many stages of lockdown with almost a complete economic shutdown. Borders are closed. A Malaysian border is closed. A lot of Asian country borders are closed. We see that hospital systems all around the world are overwhelmed in the US, in the UK, and we are thankful that Malaysia has not reached such a situation. We hope, of course, that it will never reach such a situation. And more importantly, a state of emergency sometimes has been declared in some countries. Now, whether or not we should declare a state of emergency, I think that depends on the legislation of those countries. For example, some countries need to declare a state of emergency in order to tap into some type of emergency budget, or some countries need to declare a state of emergency in order to close the borders. In Malaysia, a state of emergency has now been enacted in Batu Sapi because of the impact of the pandemic in Sabah, and there's worries about how an election there may worsen. Interestingly, the only known preventative measure now is actually just social distancing, or what the government now calls as physical distancing. And the government has put into place measures never seen before to force physical distancing. And this came in the form of a Movement Control Order 2020, which was first announced on March 18. I remember when it was announced, I remember thinking, wow, these are measures that I've never seen in my life. I've never known in the history of Malaysia, where Malaysians cannot exit, non-citizens cannot come in, everybody has to stay home, businesses have to shut. You can't gather in places of worship or places where there are mass gatherings. And it's interesting. I've never before seen these kind of measures, which is akin to me, like some emergency measures which are put in place sometimes during wartime, or when there's unrest. We see a lot of businesses had to close. When the MCO was first announced, all non-essential businesses had to close, and only businesses which were in the medical line, pharmacies, or groceries, or restaurants could open. Everyone else had to shut. And it doesn't mean that you cannot do business. With the closure of non-essential businesses, I think that then there came a culture of work from home, which is what I'm doing now. Everybody's working from home. Mostly everybody's working from home, in order to put some physical distancing between you and the public, you and everyone else. We can see there was a drastic impact on the travel industry as borders shut all around the world. People stopped traveling. There was a very drastic cut in demand for travel. And you see hotels, they have no other source of income except to register themselves as quarantine stations, because then at least they would have some kind of reimbursement at being a quarantine station. So really, this is the best time if you want to go to any 5-star hotels. They've all resorted to this in order to stay afloat. Of course, there's impact on traditional business, the traditional mom and pop shops, your goreng pisang, your keropok leko, those kind of people. At the beginning of the MCO, they could not do business. So that's a traditional business. And of course, there was an impact on the gig economy, especially with the advent of Grab and Food Panda. The gig economy on the opposite side of the spectrum started to gain more momentum and started to grow, especially when their businesses were digitalized. And the most sad sad thing was that there was a prohibition or restriction really on social gatherings in Malaysia, and we went through Deepavali, Hari Raya, and we could not have large scale celebrations and festivals. So that's some of the impact of COVID-19 in Malaysia thus far. Certainly, it's a very different scenario than what we were used to and what we've ever seen before. In Malaysia, now let's talk about the legal stuff. In Malaysia, there are two main legislations to combat the impact and effect of COVID-19 in Malaysia. The first and the most important being the Prevention and Control of the Infectious Diseases Act 1988. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to it as the Infectious Diseases Act because it's quite a mouthful. And secondly, the Temporary Measures for Reducing the Impact of the Coronavirus Disease 2019 Act, COVID-19 Act, which was passed a while back, which was gazetted very recently. And the second act, we are not going to talk about very much today, but just as a run through, I'm just going to let you know that actually that act is not meant to be preventing and controlling infectious diseases. Rather, it is an act that's been put in place in order to address the repercussions that has come about as a result of the actions taken by the government under the Prevention and Control of the Infectious Diseases Act. So for example, Section 7 of the COVID-19 Act, there's some contracts there which application has been paused, which enforcement cannot be carried out, and those measures have been put in place so that they will not prejudice someone whose rights have been impacted by the government's decision to place everyone on a movement control order. So that's more contractual, more commercial. We're not going to talk about that today. Okay, today we're going to talk about the Infectious Diseases Act. Now, one thing that was very interesting, I suppose, when I was doing my research into this act is that from 1988 until now, it has remained the same. The only thing that has changed is actually the first schedule of the act. The first schedule of the act lists a list of infectious diseases, which the government can then enact regulations in order to protect against. Okay, so that the schedule has been changed as new diseases emerge, and some of the diseases now listed under the Infectious Diseases Act are the avian influenza, cholera, dengue, diphtheria, Ebola, leprosy, measles, MERS-CoV, rabies, and so on and so forth. So this has changed whenever new diseases have emerged. It has been used very sparingly. I think before this pandemic, not many were aware of the existence of the Infectious Diseases Act. It was used to combat JE in 1999, hand, foot, and mouth disease in 2006, where most of the time this act has been used to declare a local infected area. A local infected area which would then, as you will see, we'll go through that later, allow the government to enact certain regulations in order to regulate movement or business activities within that area. Okay, so today's talk, we are going to talk about mainly what are the preventative measures that are available to the government under the Infectious Diseases Act, and what are the control measures available to the government under the Infectious Diseases Act. Okay, and later on we will have a short and brief discussion about whether these measures are sufficient or whether we will need more in place in order to better combat this act. Okay, so let's start with prevention. Okay, prevention refers to the action of stopping something from happening. So in the context of infectious disease, the prevention refers to stopping a certain disease from entering into Malaysia, or in a different context, to stop a certain disease from entering the rest of Malaysia from one area in Malaysia. So that's prevention control. Okay. Now, the Infectious Diseases Act only actually has three main prevention provisions, and that's a declaration of infected area, examination of vehicles, and prohibition on import-export. Okay, it's not actually very extensive, and let's talk about what these three protections are. Section 6 of the Infectious Diseases Act actually allows a government to declare such area to be an infected area. Now, this is not to be confused with an infected local area. This actually allows the government to declare a place outside Malaysia as infected. So for example, let's say there has been an outbreak of a contagious disease in let's say Hong Kong. Okay, and right now it's kind of confined to Hong Kong. What this allows the government to do is declare Hong Kong as an infected area. And when they do that, Section 6, Sub 3 allows the government, the Minister of Health, to, by regulations, prescribe measures to be taken to prevent the introduction of those diseases into Malaysia. I'll give you a very easy example. In September of this year, Malaysia declared an entry ban on countries with more than 150,000 COVID-19 cases. Some of these countries included the US, the UK, Brazil, Italy. So what it means is that these citizens from those countries, even if there are flights coming into Malaysia, automatically they're barred from coming to Malaysia. Pursuant to Section 6 Sub 3, the government should, if it hasn't already, enact regulations to actually formalize that entry ban. So that is what this section actually allows the government to do. The second thing is allowing the government or an authorized officer to enter into a vehicle which has come from a different country if they believe that that vehicle carries some type of contaminants which may be infectious. Okay, so this section actually allows them to do it when they enter into Malaysia. So for example, if you have a truck coming in from Singapore or Brunei or Thailand, and the government has reason to believe that there could be possible contaminants in there, if let's say there was an vehicle in order to that. Okay, one example of this is luxury liners. I think many of us have read in the news where luxury liners anchor within Malaysian ports. What the Ministry of Health has done is to go into those luxury liners in order to assess whether there are contaminants or whether there are traces of the infectious diseases there. Okay, actually without these provisions, basically actually all has to be law in order for you to do something. So if the Ministry of Health says you have to enter that vehicle in order to check, actually what makes it legal is these provisions. So it's not a matter of the government's directions and then it has to be followed through. You must actually have a base in law in order to do that. Okay, and the third and last preventive measure that can be taken is the prohibition on importing or exporting human remains or pathogenic organisms or substances. So the Act says that no one shall knowingly import into or export out of Malaysia human remains, human tissues, pathogenic organisms or substances thereof. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory. If, for example, there's an infectious disease within Malaysia that's not out in the world, there is a prohibition on carrying that pathogen out of the country, obviously in order to prevent the infection from spreading to other countries. And likewise, if there is a infectious disease from another country, you cannot bring that disease in. Okay, so that's an offense to do that. When I was doing my research for this talk, I came across this article, which is very interesting. I read it in the Malay Mail. As you can see, it was published in 2017. So even before we can ever think about this pandemic, an article like this arrived. Many of you health practitioners will probably remember the Nipah virus, which was ravaging the town of Nipah in Negeri Sembilan, I believe, back in 1999. In 1999, when it was, when the Nipah virus was spreading with when the Nipah virus was spreading across Malaysia with devastating effects, there was a virologist at that time was linked to who suspected that there was more to this virus than we remember. So I think the response back then was that people believed the mosquitoes to be a vector. So they thought that it was spread by mosquitoes, and the response was to kill mosquitoes. Interestingly, this virologist and a neurologist as well maybe you know their names, but I will not name them in this talk. They realized something very interesting, which is that only a certain section of society was being infected by the Nipah virus, and that section of society is actually Chinese pig farmers. So in their minds, they're thinking that if this was a mosquito-borne disease, then everybody actually ought to be infected, not just the people who handle pigs or eat pigs, because the of course the Muslim population in Malaysia don't do that. What this virologist did actually was that he bundled up the disease in his suitcase, brought it to the CDC in the US, and from there, with the facilities that was available to the CDC, he was able to find out that the virus was actually not a mosquito-borne virus. It was a paramyxovirus. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrongly. And as you would know, the Nipah virus is now listed in WHO's lists of diseases, which is likely or which possibly can create a pandemic. So you can imagine this student actually broke the rules. He brought the disease, the pathogen out of Malaysia, and actually by doing so saved Malaysia, potentially saved the world from a pandemic as well. And because after the discovery was made, then the government changed its response and started culling all the pigs in order to contain the virus. And that also resulted in an overhaul of pig farming in Malaysia. And as you know, there's not been an outbreak of Nipah virus in Malaysia to date since the event. Okay, so this student, I mean, if you follow the provisions of law, he's not allowed, obviously, to bring the pathogens out unless with prior permission. He's gotten the relevant approvals. That the accounts differ as to whether he smuggled it out or whether he did obtain the approvals. But if he did smuggle it out, it would have been a breach of the act. Okay, so sufficient. Let's talk about whether the measures for prevention are sufficient. As we had gone through, it was declaration of infected area, examination of vehicles, and the prohibition on import and export of human remains and pathogen. So undoubtedly, a question now arises, and more relevant than ever: is the prevention methods that are put in place by the Infectious Diseases Act sufficient in light of the current pandemic? And if it isn't, I think the first thing I would like to highlight is that even if it isn't, because we cannot actually always predict the way in which a disease may operate, Section 31 of the Act actually allows the Minister of Health to come out with regulations swiftly in order to manage the epidemics or pandemics as they emerge. Okay. I want to draw an example here to Singaporean Infectious Diseases Act. The Singaporean Infectious Diseases Act has actually been amended twice. They have amended, there was one time where they've amended it in order to respond to the SARS virus. Now, we didn't do that. We also didn't respond to the MERS virus in that way, but Singapore did. And the preventive measures available to the Singaporean government actually include also declaring an infected area in and outside of Singapore, and also being able to address infected vehicles like ships. For example, what they do is they require the ship to quarantine in a quarantine anchorage, and then there is actually a prohibition on disembarkation of the passengers. There's also a prohibition on the discharge of baggage, and there's a prohibition on discharge of cargo and articles. Now, we see these preventive measures are not actually available under the Malaysian regulation, although we have the ability to go and inspect a vehicle. What the Singaporean government has, in accordance to its laws, is a extension of that power, with going into the vessel and examining. They're able then to take other actions, which on the face of the act is not similarly readily available to the Malaysian government. They also require medical examinations of persons leaving Singapore or entering into Singapore. I think some countries, for example, like Australia, they have this as part of their immigration regulations as well, in order to control diseases in Australia. They're just very strict about it. But one very interesting thing that was within the Singaporean Infectious Diseases Act that is not similarly within ours is the Singaporean government's ability to compel someone entering Singapore to be vaccinated. Okay, so that's one of the preventive measures. If someone does not have a vaccine and they're coming to Singapore, you have to be vaccinated in that way. So that's, I think, one thing that we can think about as well, perhaps to have a provision on minimum vaccination before you enter into the country. Okay, so the question that arises is if the minister can actually if they can put this, so if they can make regulations to address this, then why does it have to be in statute? Unlike Singapore, the Malaysian statute has generalized many things and gives power to the minister to come up with ad hoc regulations in order to address the pandemic as it progresses. By having it in statute though already before having to go onto a regulation, this allows the government to act more swiftly. So for example, if there is already a provision in law about how to quarantine a vessel, like a luxury liner when it comes into Malaysia, Singapore rather, then they know exactly how to operate, how to put that into quarantine, what to do with the passengers, what kind of treatment is available to them. And in Malaysia, when we don't have the corresponding provision, what happens is that a luxury liner comes, MKN has to discuss about what's the best approach about it, and then come up with ad hoc instructions on the go. So this can be frustrating, I believe, for the passengers and also medical personnel when they are not sure about what their obligations are under law or rights under law. And this will result in a confused state and will also delay action, which is not necessarily the best response in an emergency. So I think when we are faced with an emergency and there's a small window, there's a small gap of response time, it is better to have that all in statute, already ready to go, rather than giving the power to come out with those regulations as and when it is required. So that's about measures of prevention. And I think now we can proceed on to the next part of the talk, which is measures for control. So measures for control means containing or managing something that's already within our borders. That's control. So prevention was about stopping something from happening in Malaysia. Control is about stopping it from exacerbating once it's within our borders. In comparison to the preventive measures available to the government, there are more provisions on control. So there's a requirement to notify. These are actually only some of them. These are not all of them, but these are the most of an infected local area. There's a prohibition on acting in such a way as to spread the infectious disease, isolation, which is aka quarantine, observation and surveillance of contacts, disinfection, and measures to dispose of the dead. So I propose that we go through each of the sections to understand what measures are available to the government. Okay, the first important measure is the requirement to notify of an infectious disease. If you are aware that there's a possibility of an infectious disease within your household, whether it's COVID-19 or whether any other infectious disease, there is a requirement to notify, okay? And the obligation is on various people: adult occupant of the house, person in charge of or in the company of, or being a medical practitioner attending on a person suffering from an infectious disease or died from an infectious disease, a medical practitioner that treats and becomes aware. So at any time, I think the best about it is that anytime you come into contact with an infectious disease or someone with an infectious disease, there is an obligation to notify the nearest district health office or government health facility or police that there is such a disease, okay? I think back when the regulations were first introduced in Malaysia, a lot of employers actually had asked, do they have an obligation to notify the authorities if one of their employees have become sick with COVID-19? And the answer is yes, because any person in the company of or person suffering from an infectious disease has the obligation to notify. That's the first and most practical measure of control. Okay. This is just an extension, person in charge of a boarding house. Also, if you look at subsection 4, it tells the police officer what to do once they have a notification, which is actually at the same government health facility. The second measure for control is a declaration of an infected local area. And this is the measure that has been most used by the Malaysian government in battling the COVID-19 pandemic. What the government can do is actually declare an area, an infected local area, and subsection 2 of section 11 then allows the government to prescribe measures to be taken to control or prevent the spread of any infectious disease within that infected local area. So before COVID-19, the infected local areas have been declared in the past, okay? I think they were recently declared in Sarawak for the rabies. There was also hand, foot, and mouth disease. So any time there's an outbreak of infectious disease, the government can do that. The measures to be prescribed have, however, never been as extensive as the COVID-19. The measures had to be prescribed by way of regulation, and as some of you may remember, the Malaysian government declared every area within Malaysia, every state, every area within Malaysia an infected local area, and that allowed the government to put into place a measure to prevent the movement of persons within those infected local areas. That is, what we know as the movement control order. They also prescribe measures like the closure of businesses, the mass closure of businesses, except for essential services, and also they put into place measures like take away, dine in. If you dine in, how many people to a table? If you take away, how many people in queue, how far apart you should stand from each other. All those are measures that can be taken. So as you can see, subsection 2 is actually quite wide because there's no limitation on the measure that the minister can prescribe under the act in order to combat an infected local area. Okay. Of course, also they can, as subsection 3 shows, they can also compel category of persons to undergo treatment, etc. Okay. Subsection 4 is interesting. It says here, it shall be lawful for an authorized officer to use force in order to ensure compliance with the direction. Actually, this is a very drastic measure. It allows the government to use force in order to compel something. So this is where we bring in the military, perhaps, or the police for EMCO, because it's possible to use force. The act allows you to use force to ensure compliance. Section 12 is also very important. Infected persons cannot act in a manner likely to spread the infectious disease. And I think we've also read reports of this. There were people who were supposed to be under isolation or observation, who went out into public, and then that had caused the disease to be exacerbated. For example, like the Sivaganga cluster. And that's also a penalty which resulted in the person spreading the disease to be impose a jail term. Okay, section 14 is isolation, which is what we colloquially known as quarantine. It says here, an authorized officer may cause any person who is infected or whom he believes has or whom he has reason to believe is infected to be removed to a quarantine station. Okay, now section 14 is interesting. Section 14 is interesting because isolation here is in this section is actually there's very little measures about isolation. So it says here, remove to a quarantine station. There's nothing in law to actually explain what a quarantine station is, which means that the government has to designate quarantine station as they come. And if you look at the Gazette, the subsidiary legislation to this act shows all these quarantine stations which have been gazetted by the government as and when the pandemic has ravaged. So a lot of the hotels are now included within quarantine stations, and some other facilities. But there's nothing in the act that ad hoc says, okay, this area is a designated quarantine station and is ready, prepped to go at any single time, right? Some acts, I think the one in Singapore has that, where they have a prescribed quarantine station which is upkept at all times, so it's ready to be utilized in the event of a emergency pandemic or emergency situation. It's ready to be utilized. We don't have that in Malaysia. Okay, it also says it may detain the person at the station until he can be discharged without danger to the public. So there, I think in respect of COVID-19, we know that the detention is actually for 14 days, which is when you clear the second test. After 14 days, if you have tested negative, you are unlikely to have COVID-19, so you may be released. But there are no other measures on isolation. For example, the prohibition of people visiting you, prohibition on you going out to get any essential services or non-essential services, even prohibition on carrying out certain acts. So all that's not within the act. It just says you have to be isolated with no further guidance on what you are allowed to do within isolation, or more importantly, what you're not allowed to do while you're in isolation. And I think that also does cause some problems, because a lot of people who are meant to be under isolation then escape isolation, because there's very little provisions in the act to address what happens if you break isolation. Again, the government can rectify it by coming out with regulations, but within your act, immediately you can spring into action. The public officers can go and do their periodic calls on you to put any tracker devices on you and things like that. So that I think should be contemplated by the government in deciding how to improve this act. Section 15, there's also observation and surveillance of contacts. So anyone, the authorized officer may order any contact to undergo observation in such a place or for such a period, and again, may use force to compel it. Section 18 talks about disinfection and closure of premises. If they have reason to believe that a certain area has been infected, an authorized officer may do any of this, which is examine the person, examine the premises, order the premises to be disinfected, even order perhaps the premises to shut. So that is what the government can do. So we have heard of things like this, like I think more recently was the Top Glove one, where there's a cluster, and the government has now mandated that an EMCO be enacted there. Okay, so now we come to the more interesting part about the talk today, which is that the Infectious Diseases Act, is it outdated or is it relevant? We spoke about how the Infectious Diseases Act in Singapore was amended several times. More recently in 2003, in order to combat SARS. The UK has a Public Health Control of Disease Act 1984, and then they went out with the coronavirus regulations, which is quite similar to our MCO, except that it lays down more measures, like what to do under isolation, what to do under quarantine, etc., that kind of thing. Section 11(2) of our Infectious Diseases Act, like I said, gives the Minister of Health or the government the ability to quickly pass regulations in order to respond to the pandemic as it happens. Okay, and this has happened. So our movement control orders, etc., that's all been passed. That's all been enacted pursuant to the prevention and control of the infectious diseases measures within infected local area regulations 2020. Now, there have been various installments of these regulations. We are currently up to number 8. So it's been amended 8 times. And of course, there's also within that regulations a power of the Director General of Health to issue directions. So an example of this is the compulsory wearing of masks. There's no regulation on wearing masks in Malaysia. There's no law on wearing masks in Malaysia, but the Director General of Health, under this regulation, has the power to mandate something. So when he came out, I think it was August, to say everybody has got to wear masks, that becomes the law. Okay, so quite powerful there. Like I said, a lot of the act is very general. They're very ad hoc how they respond to it, because there's no quarantine regulations that are in place, no inspection regulations that are in place, and this all leads to confusions on enforcement. So I think there are many times where person A says this, person B says this, and then person A doesn't get enforced, person B doesn't get enforced. It causes a lot of confusion because it's very ad hoc. Without there being proper regulations, or at least a very at least a framework of operation, it becomes very unclear what you can do or what you cannot do. And the problem with this is that it creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses, and it creates uncertainty for people. They do not know how long is this CMCO going to be in place. How long are the measures within a CMCO are going to be in place? Do you have the quarantine at home, or can you quarantine in a hotel? Can you choose where you quarantine? Can you have takeout when you quarantine? Can you grab food when you quarantine? You know, all those change in our situation, change with time. But if those are already within the act, then we know, okay, you quarantine, it's here, you have no choice, got to do 14 days, this is what you have to do. And there's also no measure within our current act to compel a certain patient to undergo periodic medical examinations. Okay, so I think some of the provisions within the Singaporean Infectious Diseases Act can be imported into ours, and I think it should be. So, for example, the prohibition on mass gathering, that's already within their act. That's not within our act, although it's within our regulations. The prohibition on movement, restriction of movement of goods, carrying out of certain such acts, closure of certain premises, all that is actually already within the act. So the moment the pandemic started for them, they were able to use the act as it is in order to combat. In contrast, Malaysia had to respond by way of regulations. So it's a slower response time in that sense. Okay, the flip side is that you will never know what you're up against until you're up against it. And with the generality of the Infectious Diseases Act, it does give our government more leeway to change the regulations as it deems fit. So, for example, when the MCO was first enacted, there was a restriction on the opening of non-essential businesses. When things improved, the government decided that non-essential businesses can operate, right? Because they believe from an economic standpoint, that was what was required. If you have that within the act, all businesses cannot operate, then it also does tie their hands in terms of what they can or cannot do. So it's really a pro and con thing. Do we want the freedom to legislate when we are faced with a problem so that we are able to pinpoint and able to specifically address a problem? Or do we want it already available, present within our act, so that we can spring into action? There's no confusion, there is no delay in enforcement, and we can tackle the pandemic better. Okay, I think our Infectious Diseases Act is pretty sufficient in the sense that there are sufficient provisions within it that allow the government to take very effective measures. But I think we cannot rest on our laurels. So this is the first time we are faced with a pandemic such as the COVID-19. It's the first time we have had to take such drastic measures. And for the future, we have to be ready for such a thing to arise again. So we cannot tuck away our Infectious Diseases Act as being not applicable once the pandemic is over. We should always just revisit it and think about how we can improve things, because as history has shown, pandemics litter across history, and something else will arise again, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years, and we want to be better prepared when that happens. So it's all lessons to be learned, lessons that we can learn from SARS, from MERS, and more importantly, lessons that we can learn from COVID-19. Okay, let's move on to the last portion of the talk, which is about penalties. Within the COVID-19 Act, it is a penalty if you breach any of the provisions, like on isolation, on requirement to notify. If you breach it, there is a penalty. Okay, in respect of a first offense, to imprisonment not exceeding 2 years, or to a fine. Respect of a second or subsequent offense, to imprisonment not exceeding 5 years, or fine, and so on and so forth. The fine is not actually listed within the Act. The fine is listed within the regulations. Regulation 11 of the Prevention and Control of Infectious Diseases measure within local infected areas number 8, 2020. The fine is actually now 1,000 ringgit, not exceeding 1,000 ringgit, or to a term of imprisonment not exceeding 6 months, or to both. In recent times, there have been calls to increase the penalty from 1,000 to 10,000 or something like that, so that people are more fearful about it. There has been a debate on both sides of the spectrum, especially where people are desperate to go out to get help, but if that is against the regulations, then they have to pay a fine. There is talk about it, but I think for now the 1,000 ringgit fine is what is the legal requirement now, and there's been no change to it thus far. Okay, so I think that's all I have for you. I hope this has been informative for you. So I'm happy to take questions over chat. Thank you.
Is there any questions for Sara? All right. If there is no question, thank you so much, Sara, for speaking on this session. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and have a good day. All right. Bye.
Bye.